tutorial. My name's Emily Washburn.
And my name is Kaitlyn Bauer.
And first we're going to be looking at the external structures. So let's look at the outermost layers of the brain. The dura mater is a thick, leathery membrane layer that protects the brain and spinal cord from infections and trauma. The dura mater is the outermost of 3 layers called the meninges. These are removed in this dissection for clearer observation. The cerebral hemispheres are 2 halves of the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and there are many structures within the cerebral hemispheres that function to control fine movement, social behavior, expression of emotions, memory, and cognitive functioning. The frontal lobe is the largest lobe near the forehead. It's responsible for many cognitive functions like mood, memory, decision-making, planning, and executive movement. The parietal lobe has 2 lobes located near the middle or the top of the head, and they contain structures that process and interpret sensory information from the outside world. The temporal lobe is on the side and on the lower side of the brain, and they process audio and encode memory. The occipital lobe is the smallest lobe in the back of the head, and it is the visual processing center. The cerebellum is Latin for little brain and is located towards the back of the brain. It coordinates voluntary movements. The olfactory bulb, and olfaction is the sense of smell, and you have 2 olfactory bulbs, and these are pairs of sensory tissues which process the sense of smell. The optic nerves originate from the back of each eye and send visual signals to various parts of the brain and ultimately relays to the occipital lobe. The optic chiasm is part of the brain where the optic nerves cross hemispheres, and they integrate their visual information from both eyes so that the information from each is received on both sides of the brain. The pituitary gland is also known as the master gland and produces hormones that regulate several integral bodily functions. They regulate growth, metabolism, and reproduction. The medial longitudinal fissure is a deep groove that separates the 2 cerebral hemispheres down the middle line of the brain. The transverse fissure is a deep groove that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, and it also separates the temporal lobe from the occipital lobe. The pons is located in the brainstem, meaning it plays a role in vital functions. It controls unconscious movements and processes like sleeping and breathing, and the pons also relays signals between the cortex and the cerebellum. The medulla oblongata is located at the base of the brainstem just above the spinal cord. It is responsible for the most primal functions of life, including the regulation of cardiac output and respiration. It controls vital functions of the body like heartbeat, circulation, and breathing, and it also controls reflexes like coughing and sneezing, which don't get relayed as much. But next we're going to look at the internal structures from a mid-sagittal cut into the brain. Making a mid-sagittal cut is like a mirror image plane. It is formed by making a vertical cut down the center of the brain, creating a symmetrical right and left halves. The olfactory bulb, again, here's a view of it from the internal structures. There are 2, and they send signals to different parts of the brain to be processed for smell.
Again, here's another perspective of the optic nerve from our mid-sagittal section. Here we have the thalamus. The thalamus is the information passing system between the brain and the body. All senses except for smell are processed through the thalamus. Just below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus, which is involved in homeostatic functions like eating and drinking, growth, and body temperature. And it also acts as an endocrine gland, meaning it secretes hormones into the bloodstream by working closely with the pituitary gland to ultimately regulate body functioning and behavior. The pons, which we viewed earlier, is located in the brainstem and ultimately plays a role in vital functions. Here is the medulla oblongata from another perspective, located just at the base of the brainstem above the spinal cord. The corpus callosum, seen here, connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and it creates a highway for long-distance communication between each hemisphere. The pineal gland is another endocrine gland secreting hormones into the bloodstream. It's responsible for regulating the circadian rhythm via the secretion of melatonin and helps the body know when to be asleep versus awake. Now we're going to look at more internal structures and review some internal structures we have previously seen by making a coronal incision into our sheep brain. To make our coronal cut, the coronal or crown plane separates the anterior front and posterior back sides of the brain. To imagine this plane, imagine placing a crown on your head and cutting where your fingers touch. For the sake of this tutorial, it is best to make an incision that goes to the pineal gland, which is circled along the dashed line shown. And it's also good to try to make the cuts on either part of the brain or either section as symmetrical as possible. Now we're looking at the gray matter of the cortex through our coronal section. The gray matter contains cell bodies of neurons. The dendrites on the cell bodies of neurons receive electrochemical signals from other neurons, and therefore the gray matter of the cortex is largely responsible for receiving and relaying signals. Whereas the underlying white matter is bundles of myelated axons. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer on neurons composed of lipids and proteins, and they increase the firing rate of action potentials. The composition of myelin leads to its white appearance, and therefore the underlying white matter is largely involved in transmitting signals to other parts of the brain and body. Again, we have the corpus callosum connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, creating the long-distance highway we've mentioned. The pineal body is shown here from our coronal section. Now let's look at the CA3 region of the hippocampus. Just to start, the hippocampus is responsible for memory and learning, and the CA3 region is a subsection of the hippocampus, and it's associated with the retrieval of memories. We have the CA3 region highlighted in purple on the diagram. Now let's look at the CA1 region of the hippocampus. It is another subfield of the hippocampus, and it's associated with the consolidation of memories. Let's consolidate your memory of the hippocampus. To remember the hippocampus's function, remember that you would never forget if you saw a hippo on campus. The substantia nigra is the site of dopamine production. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in controlling movement and pleasure and reward. Because the substantia nigra is responsible for producing dopamine, its deterioration is associated with Parkinson's disease, a neurodegenerative disorder that leads to a loss of control of motor functioning. Again, we have the pituitary gland located at the base of the brain. This is our master gland that produces hormones that regulate bodily functions, with the main ones being growth, metabolism, and reproduction. This is the end of our tutorial, and as you're going through your own dissection, we think it's important to remember that the sheep brain is very similar to the human brain. Despite being proportionately smaller, all the structures and functions we have identified today are reflective of our own neural anatomy and physiology. And that's a wrap on the sheep dissection tutorial. Thank you for watching, and happy learning and dissecting.
Goodbye!